Barbara Kent was just a forgotten widow on a quiet street, until deputies broke open her basement and found cages, body parts, and a map of cities marked for horror. Richard Kent, her vanished nephew, was believed to be the monster behind it. All until the FBI realized he might only be subject one. Caleb Rowan, a ghost from a survivalist cult, emerged next, carrying out plans written by someone no one could identify. Each name uncovered a deeper layer. Each clue led further away, from Elmridge and deeper into a nationwide nightmare. This wasn't just one man's madness. It was a system designed, deployed, and still spreading to in the quiet town of Elmridge. Few people ever locked their doors. It was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone, where crime was rare and people still trusted their neighbors. That's why, when Barbara Kent hadn't been seen for several weeks, most of her neighbors assumed she was simply visiting family. A few noticed the stack of unopened mail wedged in her mailbox, or the newspapers collecting on her porch, but no one thought to raise an alarm, until a distant cousin called the sheriff's office, saying she hadn't heard from Barbara in over a month. That call would spark a chain of events that would lead to one of the most disturbing discoveries in state history. Two deputies arrived at Barbara's home on a gray Thursday morning. The air was unusually still. Her house sat at the end of Sycamore Lane, tucked behind an overgrown hedge and a rusted iron gate. The property looked like it had been forgotten. The lawn was wild with weeds, windows were covered with thick layers of grime, and the porch boards creaked under the slightest weight. The deputies knocked several times and called out Barbara's name. When no response came, they circled around the property. A side window had been nailed shut from the inside. The back door was locked, but through the glass, they could see something odd. Chairs turned upside down, furniture pushed against the walls, and piles of old clothes stacked in corners like insulation. After contacting dispatch and receiving authorization to perform a forced entry, they pried open the front door. The moment they stepped inside, the smell hit them. It was a foul combination of rotting meat, mildew, and something else, something chemical. Dust floated thick in the stale air. The house was dark, the curtains drawn tightly, and several rooms appeared to be untouched for years. The floor was covered in newspaper, stained with black patches of something sticky. The kitchen was strangely clean, its appliances old but polished. A calendar on the wall was stuck on April 2019. It hadn't been touched since. There was no sign of Barbara. Her bedroom was empty, her bed made, but a strange humming noise could be heard faintly throughout the house. Following the sound, the deputies were led to a door at the end of the hallway. It was bolted shut with several padlocks. The door itself was reinforced with a metal sheet and bore deep scratches around the frame. With growing unease, the deputies called for backup. When additional units arrived, they breached the door. Behind it was a steep staircase leading down into the basement. The deeper they descended, the stronger the smell became. The humming noise intensified. The basement was pitch black. Using flashlights, the officers scanned the space, and what they saw chilled them. The room was divided by plywood walls into a series of small compartments. One area resembled a crude lab, complete with a stained operating table, surgical instruments, and jars filled with unidentifiable substances. Another section housed dozens of VHS tapes, meticulously labeled with dates. There were cages, multiple, some large enough to hold a person, others small, but all equipped with locks and chains. The cages were empty, but claw marks and dried blood hinted at what had once occurred there. In the far corner, a deep freezer sat humming quietly. When opened, it revealed a horror none of them could prepare for. Inside were severed limbs, torsos, and even a few heads, wrapped in plastic, frozen solid, and tagged with names and numbers. None matched anyone from recent missing persons cases. Most disturbing was the presence of child-sized remains among the others. the scene was immediately secured and the property was declared a crime scene. Forensics began documenting every inch of the basement. Authorities searched the rest of the house, uncovering more disturbing evidence. Journals filled with handwritten notes about anatomy, survival experiments, and chilling references to subjects and cycles. Strange symbols were carved into the walls behind paintings and beneath floorboards. The deeper investigators looked, the more unsettling the picture became. What baffled authorities most was the man listed as the property's co-owner, Richard Kent, Barbara's nephew. According to county records, Richard had lived there until 3 years ago, then disappeared without any trace. No employment records, no tax filings, no digital footprint. Neighbors remembered him as quiet, polite, always working in his garage. No one had seen him in years. Barbara herself was still missing, her whereabouts a mystery. But based on the evidence in the house, investigators feared the worst. What began as a simple welfare check had become something far darker and much larger in scale. Local police quickly realized they were in over their heads. That's when the FBI stepped in, not yet knowing the full extent of what they were about to uncover. The FBI arrived in Elmridge less than 48 hours after the basement was discovered. A specialized task force from Quantico took over the scene, bringing with them forensic experts, profilers, and analysts. Local law enforcement stood back as black SUVs rolled through Sycamore Lane, turning the quiet street into a temporary operations center. News crews gathered at the edge of the police perimeter, broadcasting the first details of what they called the House of Horrors. But most of what had been found inside was still kept from the public. What lay beneath the Kent home was unlike anything federal agents had encountered before. The tapes were the first pieces of evidence to undergo analysis. There were over 300 of them, all labeled with numbers and dates, going back nearly 2 decades. The earliest recordings were grainy, poorly lit, and silent. They showed individuals, sometimes restrained, sometimes unconscious, being subjected to what could only be described as experiments. Some tapes revealed people trapped in the cages, others documented invasive procedures, and a few showed what looked like psychological testing, sleep deprivation, sensory overload, and forced isolation. Faces were often obscured or turned away from the camera, making identification nearly impossible. Several of the victims were seen across multiple tapes, suggesting they had been kept alive for extended periods. As the footage progressed chronologically, the production quality improved. Sharper images, cleaner audio, multiple angles. The later tapes had eerie titles written in black marker, such as Cycle 3A, Subject Determination, and Mother Trial. One tape simply read Barbara, Phase End. Agents fast-tracked that one, but it didn't show what they expected. Barbara Kent was indeed on screen, alive, looking weak and disoriented. The recording ended abruptly with her being wheeled into a separate room, never appearing again in any other footage. There was no evidence of her body among the recovered remains. Digital forensics pulled hard drives and storage devices from the basement lab. They revealed encrypted logs, research files, and diagrams detailing human anatomy and behavioral patterns. Some entries referenced control variables, reconditioning thresholds, and genetic sustainment. None of it made sense. In a scientific context, it was the rambling documentation of a person who believed they were conducting legitimate research, but with no ethical or medical oversight. The files hinted at a philosophy that blurred the lines between science, torture, and obsession. The FBI's behavioral unit built a profile of the likely perpetrator based on the journals and footage. They described someone methodical, extremely intelligent, and deeply delusional. This person viewed victims not as people, but as subjects to manipulate and document. Whoever built the basement had planned it meticulously. The ventilation system was soundproofed, the electricity was rerouted, and backup generators ensured nothing ever failed. Supplies had been bought using fake names and burner accounts. Even the cages had serial numbers filed off. This wasn't someone improvising. This was someone executing a plan. Year after year, AS agents tracked down every piece of material used in the construction of the basement. They hit a breakthrough. A small hardware store in a neighboring county still had surveillance footage from nearly 8 years ago. In one of the videos, Richard Kent could be seen purchasing large amounts of chain, concrete mix, and ventilation tubing. He paid in cash and wore gloves. The store owner remembered him vaguely, said he was polite but strange, always wearing sunglasses even indoors. A national manhunt for Richard Kent officially began. His photo, extracted from an old driver's license, was circulated across all law enforcement networks. But as the search widened, something peculiar came up. A missing persons report filed in 2012 listed a man with his same name and age range, last seen in Colorado. That case had gone cold. No body had ever been recovered. Even more unsettling, the fingerprints found in the Kent home didn't match Richard's official records. It was possible he had assumed a false identity, but the deeper the FBI dug, the more questions emerged. Neighbors recalled strange activity years prior. One woman remembered hearing screaming late at night, but assumed it was from a TV. A postal worker reported that packages to the Kent house always came in unmarked boxes with no return address. Yet none of them had ever reported anything. The house had been hiding in plain sight. The FBI set up a tip line. Calls came pouring in from people across the state claiming they'd seen Richard Kent, though none could be verified. Meanwhile, DNA tests on the freezer remains turned up a disturbing detail. Several victims weren't listed in any database. No family ever reported them missing. It suggested they had lived on the fringes, drifters, runaways, or people taken from places where no one was watching. The most disturbing revelation came when agents discovered a sealed crawlspace beneath the basement. Inside was a small room, soundproofed and lined with chains. On the wall was a map of the United States with red pins in more than a dozen cities. Each pin was labeled with a date. All the dates were in the future. Whatever Richard Kent had been doing in Elmridge, it was only one part of something much bigger. The discovery of the crawlspace changed the course of the investigation. What the FBI had assumed was an isolated case rooted in a single location was now believed to be part of a much larger, calculated operation. The map pinned to the crawlspace wall featured cities from coast to coast: Chicago, Denver, Sacramento, Jacksonville, even smaller towns barely recognizable to most agents. Each red pin came with a date, all spaced months apart. None had passed yet, which meant whatever was planned hadn't occurred. Yet the implication was clear. Elmridge was only the beginning. Back at headquarters, analysts began comparing those locations to any known criminal activity, disappearances, or similar welfare checks. A pattern started to form. In 5 of the marked cities, unsolved disappearances had occurred within the last 10 years, mostly involving homeless individuals or transient populations. No connections had been made at the time. There were no consistent methods or clues. But now, with the context of the Kent house, every cold case in those areas was being re-examined under a new light. Meanwhile, the house itself continued to yield secrets. Behind a false wall in the basement lab, a steel filing cabinet was discovered, sealed with an industrial-grade lock. When agents managed to force it open, they found over 30 carefully preserved manila folders. Each folder contained a profile, photos, descriptions, surveillance notes, and even psychological observations. These weren't just random victims. They had been tracked for weeks, even months. Some files included grocery receipts, car registrations, and employment records. The folders were numbered, and horrifyingly, only 26 had been crossed out in red ink. The rest were still active. One of the uncrossed names matched a woman who had gone missing from a halfway house in Detroit only a month earlier. Her case had been dismissed as a runaway. Now, her file was in the hands of the FBI, suggesting she had been targeted. The agency issued an emergency alert and began a manhunt in the area, hoping she might still be alive. But the trail led nowhere. The halfway house had closed down weeks before. No one had seen her since. The depth of planning and the sheer volume of data suggested this operation wasn't the work of just one man. But every piece of evidence still pointed to Richard Kent. Yet no new trace of him had emerged. His bank accounts were inactive. There were no recent cell phone records, and surveillance footage from transportation hubs showed no sign of him under any known alias. It was as if he had vanished into thin air. Forensic linguists analyzed the journals and notes recovered from the house, looking for inconsistencies in writing style. Their analysis suggested that although the majority of entries were written by one person, at least two other distinct handwriting samples appeared in the margins. This confirmed what some agents feared. There were likely accomplices. Whether they were coerced, indoctrinated, or willing participants remained unknown. But it was now clear that Richard Kent had not operated alone. Further complicating matters was the discovery of synthetic drugs in a hidden storage room beneath the lab. Vials labeled with complex chemical names and coded numbers were analyzed by chemists. The substances resembled a combination of sedatives, hallucinogens, and compounds used in behavior modification studies. There were also printed manuals explaining how to manufacture these chemicals using common over-the-counter ingredients and black market supplies. It appeared that the people in the tapes weren't just being restrained, they were being altered. Psychological profiles compiled by the FBI painted Richard Kent as someone obsessed with control, viewing human behavior as something to be broken down and rebuilt. The documentation showed repeated attempts at reprogramming subjects, including schedules of food deprivation, reward cycles, and intense isolation. It wasn't just torture, it was structured, deliberate experimentation with people's minds. The public, still largely unaware of the investigation's most disturbing details, began demanding answers. Rumors circulated online about a secret network of underground labs, missing people in rural towns, and unidentified compounds affecting brain function. Conspiracy theorists seized on the story, but the truth was even stranger than fiction. Every theory had some element of fact buried within it. In a final effort to unearth more from the Kent property, ground-penetrating radar was used across the backyard and surrounding area. That's when agents found a buried septic tank that had been retrofitted as a storage vault. Inside were burned remnants of documents, melted hard drives, and bones. A forensic team reconstructed what they could, but most of the materials were unrecoverable. Whatever had been hidden in that tank was meant to stay hidden. What haunted investigators the most were the untouched folders, profiles of people who might still be out there, unaware they were being watched. The red pins on the map weren't just memories of what had been done. They were markers for what was to come. The question now wasn't just where Richard Kent was, but how far his reach extended, and how much time they had before the next date on the map arrived. The date marked on the map for Denver was approaching. It was only 3 weeks away, and the FBI moved quickly to establish surveillance teams across the city. All transportation hubs, bus stations, and hospitals in the region were quietly alerted to report any suspicious activity resembling the patterns seen in the Elm Ridge case. Every name from the uncrossed folders was entered into a new national tracking system. But the problem was vast. Some of the targets were already missing, and others hadn't been seen for months. Denver became a silent pressure point in a case that was growing colder by the day, despite how red-hot the attention around it had become. Then came a break, one that no one had expected. A truck was found abandoned on a highway in rural Kansas, midway between Elm Ridge and Denver. Inside were canisters of chemicals, surgical equipment, a handheld camcorder, and a wallet containing an ID for Richard Kent. It wasn't a fake, it matched his fingerprints exactly. The truck was wiped clean of any other identifying evidence. The fuel tank was nearly empty. No security cameras had recorded the vehicle past the last gas station 60 miles back. But the camcorder had a tape inside, and that changed everything. The tape showed what appeared to be a new location, an underground storage unit converted into a small operating room. On the table was a woman who matched the description of one of the uncrossed files. She was unconscious, attached to an 4. The recording lasted 13 minutes. There was no audio, but near the end, the camera tilted to reveal the face of the man operating the camera. It wasn't Richard Kent. It was someone else. A younger man, early 30s, dark hair, tattoo on his left wrist. The tape ended abruptly. The FBI. Facial recognition was run across national databases. No hits. But the tattoo was unique, a design that matched one used by a little-known survivalist group active in the early 2000s. That group had disbanded after a federal raid over illegal firearms, but several of its members had vanished before arrests were made. One of those men, Caleb Rowan, had never been found. His age and appearance lined up. His last known residence was in Oregon, and he had connections to medical equipment dealers and black market pharmaceutical suppliers. Suddenly, the theory that Richard Kent was working alone collapsed completely. AS agents revisited the materials from the Elmridge basement. New context emerged. One of the journal entries spoke about recruits and how the mission requires more than one set of hands. Other logs mentioned the network and replication protocols. It wasn't one lab, it was a prototype, a blueprint, and someone else had continued the work. The Denver date wasn't just a location, it was a planned activation. A multi-agency task force was formed to intercept any sign of activity in Colorado. A week before the Denver date, a missing persons report came in from a remote area just outside Boulder. A hiker had found clothing and bloodstains deep in the forest. A preliminary search uncovered a campsite, recently used, abandoned in a hurry. Underneath a camouflage tarp, agents found more lab materials, a generator, and a second map. This one only had 3 pins: Denver, Las Vegas, and Santa Fe. None had dates, but it confirmed that more sites had either already been prepared or were in the process of being built. Time was running out. The FBI initiated rolling blackouts in key areas of Denver, hoping to disrupt any underground activity. Police canvassed all storage facilities, abandoned buildings, and rental properties within a 30-mile radius. Then, just 2 days before the target date, they found something. In an industrial part of the city, behind a chain of old shipping containers, an entrance led to a concealed underground bunker. The door was locked, wired with a rudimentary alarm system. Tactical units breached. The site, what they found inside, was more advanced than the Kent basement. This bunker had medical-grade equipment, a monitoring room with live feeds from other locations, and evidence of recent activity. But no one was there. Only a single person was left behind, a woman, sedated but alive. She was identified as one of the missing profiles. Her wrists were bruised, and she had been fed through and through. But she was stable. The bunker had been cleared only hours earlier. The most chilling discovery came from the monitoring room. One screen showed live footage of a place that agents couldn't immediately identify. Another bunker, dimly lit, with someone walking past the camera. A timestamp confirmed it was real-time. The image cut out after 3 seconds. A trace of the signal revealed that it was bouncing through encrypted relays, likely from somewhere in New Mexico. The realization hit hard. The operation was mobile. There wasn't a single lab. There were many replicas, each more advanced than the last. And someone was still building them, still moving people, and still continuing the work Richard Kent had started. Only now, he may not even be in charge. The FBI began to consider the most terrifying possibility of all, that Richard Kent wasn't the architect, but only the first successful product, the idea that Richard Kent might not have been the mastermind, but instead a test subject, the first in a long line of manipulated recruits, sent shockwaves through the investigation. Everything had to be re-examined. If Kent was merely the prototype, then the entire premise of the case had changed. He wasn't the end of the horror. He was the beginning. FBI agents pored over the basement files from Elmridge again, now with new eyes. One entry, previously dismissed as incoherent rambling, suddenly stood out. It mentioned a phrase, Phase 0 complete. Deployment initiated. Vectors acquired. Analysts had assumed these were personal delusions, but with the discovery of the mobile bunkers and the new operators, the words began to take on operational meaning. Phase 0 could have referred to Elmridge, the test environment. Everything after that, fieldwork, expansion. The woman rescued in Denver had no memory of how she was taken. Toxicology reports revealed traces of the same synthetic compounds found in the Kent house. She had bruises consistent with long-term restraint, but no clear signs of surgical procedures. A neurological scan, however, showed patterns of disruption, temporary memory blocking, likely from drug exposure. It was now believed that the experiments weren't just physical. They were chemical and psychological, aimed at stripping identity and installing obedience. She may have been intended as the next Richard Kent. In the following weeks, tips began to flood in. People in Nevada and New Mexico reported hearing strange machinery, sounds from abandoned mining sites. In Santa Fe, a homeless shelter reported a man visiting weekly, claiming to be a health inspector, asking oddly specific questions about recent arrivals and their mental health. A security camera captured his image. It was the same man seen on the Denver camcorder, Caleb Rowan. He hadn't gone into hiding. He was scouting. The FBI rushed to Santa Fe. They deployed field agents across the outskirts, scanning for signs of underground structures. Their efforts paid off when a heat signature was detected beneath an old textile warehouse. A concealed entrance led to a spiral staircase descending into another bunker. This one was still active. Power ran through the walls, and fresh tire marks suggested recent supply runs. Inside, agents found what looked like the core of the operation, a control hub outfitted with servers, storage units, surgical beds, and labeled uniforms. There were crates of supplies, all packed with care, all tagged with a symbol, a crude triangle intersected with a single vertical line. It matched the tattoos seen on Caleb Rowan. More disturbing was a whiteboard covered in scribbled names and cities. Many were already crossed out. A few remained: Las Vegas, Austin, Portland. In a secured room, agents uncovered what could only be described as an indoctrination chamber. Padded walls, flashing lights, and looping audio recordings repeating phrases like "compliance is clarity" and "become what you were meant to be." A chair in the center of the room had restraints built into the arms and legs. It was all designed for psychological conditioning. And on the far wall, a framed photo of Richard Kent, labeled not as a suspect, but as Subject 1. It was clear now, Richard had been the first to undergo the full process. Broken down, reprogrammed, and released to operate independently, thinking the mission was his to control. But in reality, someone else had built the system. Caleb Rowan wasn't the creator either. He was an executor. The person behind all of this had yet to reveal themselves. Then, just as the FBI began preparations to raid the remaining suspected sites, the bunker's servers transmitted one last message, a countdown. No words, just numbers ticking down. From 72 hours. The signal repeated across the remaining sites, confirming synchronized activity. It was a final phase. Something bigger was about to happen. Emergency alerts were issued to major cities. Police were put on high alert. Hospitals, shelters, and public transit systems were told to report anything abnormal. But the true danger wasn't something that could be stopped with barricades or sirens. The danger was already moving through the country, hidden in plain sight. Recruited, programmed, and embedded, when the countdown hit zero, there were no explosions, no public displays of chaos. But within 48 hours, 7 people vanished across 3 states. Each had been listed in the original folders found in Elmridge. Their profiles had not been crossed out, but now they were gone. No signs of struggle, no digital trails. It was as if they had simply followed a signal no one else could hear. The FBI kept the details from the public. The case was labeled as active but classified at the highest level. Internally, agents referred to it as the Obedience Program. Unofficially, it became known as the Kent Protocol. To this day, no one knows exactly how far the program reached or how many of its operatives walk among us. But the original house in Elmridge, boarded up and silent, remains untouched. Locals say it still hums at night, like something beneath the floorboards is waiting to be turned on again.